Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen. I'm one of the co-founders of Psychedelic Passage, and I will be your host today. We have an exciting guest and a conversation about the Colorado landscape of psychedelic facilitation today. Really pleased to welcome Matthew Duffy. You go by Duffy, who's an Eco-Futurist, a mycopoet, and a Theresian team player. And Duffy has a background in permaculture, ecological justice, and community organizing. And he teamed with the Decriminalize Denver Initiative as a spore organizer. I love that word, for the Denver Psilocybin Initiative back in 2018, which then eventually turned into the, Prop 122 ballot initiative, which now is the Natural Medicine Health Act here in Colorado. Duffy went on to co-found SPORE, the Society for Psychedelic Outreach, Reform, and Education, and received his master's degree in resilient leadership from Naropa University. He served as the co-ecosystem director at SPORE for 2 years. So now SPORE has been composted into an organization called the Coalition, a coalition that is modeling mycelium to lay a foundation for the emergence of regenerative cultures, abundant transformative justice, responsible medicine stewardship, and holistic psychedelic ecosystems. So Duffy's now on the board of Coalition, supporting a new wave of leadership and shifting towards a more artful role in the psychedelic movement ecosystem. So welcome, Duffy. So great to have you on our podcast.
Thank you, Jimmy. Yeah, it's a pleasure and honor to be here. I will just make one little amendment in part of the intro, just for the sake of having informed listeners. The Denver Psilocybin Initiative decriminalized mushrooms in Denver, and then the policy evolution in Colorado has eventually led to the Natural Medicine Health Act. But those two initiatives weren't exactly, they didn't like go one into the other. It's just that Denver was like the gateway for a lot of the policy reform around the country. The wave of decrim started happening after Denver. Denver was the first city to decriminalize any psychedelic plant or fungal medicine since Prohibition. But yeah, I know we'll get into the landscape. Just wanted to clarify that. So
yeah, I appreciate that clarification and correction. And, for those who have listened to our episodes in the past, is that there's a little bit of a distinction between local decriminalization, which particularly just removes the penalties for possession, cultivation, consumption, use of psychedelic medicines. And there is a far jump between it moving from a decrim. Maybe it's a local municipality, maybe it's a city or a township. There's a further jump from that then moving into, let's say, state legislature, like we're seeing here in Colorado. And we have a previous episode that kind of breaks down the difference between the regulatory model, meaning folks who would be seeking licensure for service centers, healing centers, psychedelic facilitation licensure, versus the community driven model, of which Colorado has both. And so, I'd really look forward to chatting with you today, because I know that all of that, it can be confusing, how does this work for a psychedelic, curious, person? And the one thing that I find is that with just decrim models, there's really not a lot of conversation on okay, how does this work? How does this happen now? How do you engage in psychedelics? Are you just kind of out there on your own? And so I'm wondering if you could just give us some insight on what you feel is happening in the emerging, field in Colorado, maybe what that means for the larger psychedelic movement in your own perspective.
I've always found it kind of odd when people say decrim model, because I'm like, what model? Where is it? And I mean, the models that we have are the underground, and within decriminalization, there's an openness to create legal framework that aren't based in a state regulated framework. We haven't seen that yet, besides people just doing things in the gray area of the law once decriminalization happens. In Colorado, because there's this full, what I call full decriminalization, and that's debatable to a certain extent for some of the medicines in the Natural Medicine Health Act. And depending on what people consider to be like the fullest extent of decriminalization. Some people would like to include the sale of medicine, that being decriminalized, which I've just learned recently that that might be possible. But generally, as I've understood it, decriminalization, like you said, means possession, sharing, cultivation. And in Colorado, also, people can be paid for support services, harm reduction services, facilitation services. There's some stipulations around that now, that you have to disclose that you're not licensed. And there's this word that's in the law that they have to be bona fide services. So it's kind of vague as to what that means, but most people are understanding that as long as you are providing legitimate services, you're supporting as a sitter, facilitator, guide, education even, there's a case for cultivation even being a service. You can be paid for that. You just can't directly sell medicine. So think that through. It creates a kind of gray area of what's possible, and a bunch of people navigating that. So there's really no model that we have that creates a. I'll just go ahead and say, although I think there's some reasonable aversion to the word economics, but a medicine economy that's not in the state regulated framework. And I think that is a way of thinking of the task at hand for people who want to support communal medicine practices, community-based medicine stewardship, and making sure that people can give their services, provide their care services, whatever they are, and for those services to be valued in a state that currently doesn't, it's not legal to sell medicine, but there can be evaluation of these services around. So it's basically what I've heard called an economy of care that's possible now. Other sort of models for an economy ecosystem I like to look at are models for solidarity economies, sacred economics. That's a concept from Charles Eisenstein. How do we create these webs, these networks of exchanges, which basically is what economy is, make that commerce not extractive when commodification of the medicine itself is not actually legal here. Try as people might, right? So I think to the extent of the decriminalization aspect of things, that's what's available in Colorado, and it's emergent. It's something that I think will be forming in tandem with the regulatory framework, and ideally is going to braid well with what happens with the state regulated model. And that's a big part of our work, tending to the intersection. Our primary focus, though, is supporting the community capacity building outside of the regulated framework, which is where everyone is right now and where most people generally are. And I think a lot of people will want to be able to swim between the two pools.
Yeah.
So making sure that middle ground is really fertile and coalesced is going to be key.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points. We are in this emerging space where it's not exactly quite clear yet the pathways on how somebody can engage meaningfully with psychedelics. The word meaningful is extremely subjective, so it's not just seeking psychedelic assisted psychotherapy or seeking intentional psychedelic use. Somebody can have a meaningful experience having a recreational psychedelic experience. And so
Absolutely.
There's just a lot of this undefined space that we're in. And I think that you bring up a couple of important, points and distinctions as well. What qualifies bona fide or, proper support services? That to a degree is somewhat subjective. And, the other part that I think I'm hearing you say is that no matter the model, there is this prudency on creating community aspects, around it. And one thing that I always share personally is, one of my goals is trying to tackle this issue of, okay, how do we bring psychedelic medicines to this society in a way that works with the systems that we have now? I think that there is somewhat of a romanticism sometimes of going back to, let's say, more cultural aspects of psychedelic use where the medicine's revered kids have exposure through their elders to psychedelics, plant medicines, natural medicines from a very young age. The healers and the medicine keepers and carriers are integrated in our society. Well, guess what? Like, none of that stuff happens in our society today. We work in a consumerist, capitalistic model. And so, one of the things that I'm always trying to work on is like, how do we live in both worlds in which business and economics does play into it? Like, even a nonprofit has to drive some revenue so you can pay your folks and the talented people and budget for initiatives and things like that. And so it's pretty interesting when you bring up some of these concepts that I haven't heard of before, like sacred economics. I think you said like solidarity economics. I'm wondering if you could touch upon those a little bit more. Like, what does that mean?
I would be fronting if I, tried to position myself as an expert on these sort of economic frameworks. But the basic understanding that I have is that there is the extractive economic models that all of us are living in neoliberal, modern times. For the most part, most of your viewers might be living in this. And there's a kind of economics that predates humanity, that is just the exchange. Eco right there, it's like ecosystem. Eco means home. The full word economics literally means home management. So how are we taking care of our home? Currently, we live in a way that is so extractive that we're not taking care of the planet that we live on. We're not taking care of Earth. We've lost a relationality to these relationships that have an exchange, right? And in an extractive model, there's no return, or you could call it reciprocity. But the solidarity economy, they're pretty similar as far as I understand those three concepts: solidarity economy, economies of care, and sacred economics. It's shifting our values to value what actually creates a regenerative, abundant flow through exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And also make sure that the ones who care for are being cared for. Our life is dependent on so many lives, on so many life forms, on all of our relations. So in that, these are economic models that are providing an avenue for us to actually practice in our everyday lives a shift towards more of, I'll just call it an indigenous way of being in relationship. And that requires a huge value shift of what we prioritize, of where resources go, and what we prioritize in funding and feeding first and foremost, always, because we live in an extractive economic social system.
Yeah.
The design has depleted our roots for so long. Culturally, the actual soil, the sort of like vague lack of real root kind of underpinnings and connection to lineage and ancestry that a lot of people are struggling with and considering themselves as like a question that you and I have talked about before, is like, what are standards that we have around, what makes us worthy to be a medicine worker? Who has that right? One piece of what could be really critical for the foundation of a sacred economy with medicine is really prioritizing the resourcing for rites of passage with medicine work. And that would require a lot of tending to relationships with indigenous people here, and also where these medicines come from, which two of the medicines that are included in the Natural Medicine Health Act are derivatives of plants that aren't endemic to Colorado. Psilocybin mushrooms are around here, and mescaline grows in cactus around here. And just to tap on that quickly, in case any of your listeners don't know, the medicines included in the law in Colorado, ibogaine, mescaline, except from peyote, that has a different scheduling federally and in the state, psilocybin, and DMT.
Yeah, one of the big criticisms I think that the Natural Medicine Health Act received was that it moved really quickly and didn't include enough involvement, asking, and participation from indigenous peoples and traditions and lineages who are directly related to these, psychedelic medicines, especially around the conservation of peyote, of which then some, laws and regulations or restrictions were written into that. And we're in an interesting place because though the laws have kicked in now, the rulemaking is still happening. The policies and procedures of implementation are still happening.
Mhm.
I found it really interesting, hearing your connection around economics to nature. And actually that helps me understand a little bit more about, your organization and my coalition, just thinking about what mycelium does in nature,
Mhm.
right? Thinking
Exactly.
about the role of it actually being the bridge. So like, one of the things that fungi does, whether psilocybin containing or not, is that it's this composting. It breaks down material, it breaks down
Mhm.
vegetation and animals and plants and other things. It breaks it down in the soil in a way so that it can be repurposed and used. So, it's interesting to see how if you go into any, forest or population of trees, that the trees are communicating with each other through mycelium, and the trees are actually making these like sugar exchanges in exchange for vital nutrients because of the mycelium. And so it's pretty interesting when we live in a society that measures ourselves on production and on output.
Yeah.
Like every country is measured on their GDP, gross domestic product. And a lot of that is like, how can we produce more and how can we make more and what are the costs associated to that? And so one of the takeaways that I see with your baseline explanation of some of these things like sacred economics is that it's actually more of like a loop, like a
Right.
closed loop. Like how do these things actually all, feed into each other? And I'm wondering, how does that affect your view on community? Because the other part that we were framing with the decrim is like, what model, right? And then I heard you saying that, we as a community need to figure out ways to engage with each other, engage with these medicines, engage with the safe and respectable use of these things. So how does all that play together for you as far as thinking about this in the framework of community and what that means for folks?
Community is a word that gets thrown around like many words in postmodern times. It's kind of loaded. And my definition of community is there's actual real culture that bonds the community, that emerges from land and having a shared context. You don't have to have shared ideology, but having shared values and a sort of reverence for the differences. It's not to say that there aren't examples of people doing good medicine work. That would erase the many, many centuries of indigenous, deeply integrated lineage practice. And right now, I often see this juxtaposition of like regulated versus decrim,
Hmm.
which kind of that I don't like that framing because it assumes that communities don't regulate.
Hmm. Hmm.
And we do. Our bodies regulate, ecosystems regulate. We have to create, I say this often, like community sovereignty, which one way of thinking of that is building our capacity to regulate within our communities.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when we are so dependent on like a state model and everything is ready made, and there's this convenience culture, this consumerist
Things are
culture.
packaged up, things are defined
Right.
in programs, there's a structure. You go to a facilitator who's done this training and this licensure. It's almost like all it's packaged up for you, is what I'm hearing.
Right. So that strips us of our ability to really have a capacity to steward ourselves
Hmm.
and steward within community. And it's generational work to restore that, where many of us, not including myself, we didn't come from a sort of culture that had that sort of deep radical responsibility at its core. The culture that I grew up in was rooted in entitlement and rooted in also, deep injustice. And, that's why I think it's important to remember that the psychedelic movement, its current iteration, comes from this moment in American history that has roots in a countercultural movement. And it's not to say that we need to recreate that, but what we do need is a revival, is a cultural revival. And we need to tend to the culture work that can actually create responsible relationships and practices in working with medicines.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work to be done there that doesn't often get valued in a capitalist system. And so us nonprofits, we're vying for, what we can get, especially now that the money is moving from the nonprofit realm really into industry right after the laws change. It's like, okay, well, we know where the money's going now, and it's a bull market out there. So everybody's conserving and there's all this economic upheaval. But in responding well to that sort of pressure, and that's part of the need for that community sovereignty and the need to really invest in community, is as the times become more stark and there's more unraveling. And, we're speaking right now in a moment where there's great upheaval in the world.
Mm-hmm.
The need for us to build that sort of responsiveness and resilience in community requires us to take life into our hands, not to control, but to radically participate in our lives in creating alternatives to a trajectory that is honestly, ultimately suicidal on a global scale.
Yeah, we're I think there's a lot of folks who might argue that the human race is not doing that well as far as, creating sustainable futures.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, just to draw some real examples of what you're discussing, I do appreciate that you're talking about this in the realms of culture. And even that word counterculture means that it was opposite of what's accepted in mainstream society and culture. So if you were doing psychedelics back in, the 60s and 70s, you were a hippie, or you were an anarchist, or you were crazy, or you were, so and so. And so a lot of what that did was it put psychedelic use on the fringes of our society, meaning like, we're here as a normal American citizen, and then here's all these crazy people out on the periphery, like doing their stuff. Now it's different. Now there are state troopers, moms, doctors, therapists, politicians. Like, I just heard the other day that there was a sheriff's department that was actually interested in providing ketamine assisted therapy as a employee benefit. And so there's a culture shift there, right? As well.
And this is actually, I think we're tapping on the most interesting, to me, conversation in all of the psychedelic field. And it's around, when we're saying culture, essentially we're talking about collective set and setting.
Tell me more about that.
I'm actually, I just started reading this book called American Trip. I can't pronounce the man's last name. I'm sorry. His first name is Ito, but it's, stemming from the term that pretty much all of us interested in psychedelics have heard of at this point, set and setting. But instead of the emphasis being an individual's mindset and the environment for a psychedelic experience, the collective set and setting is the culture and social conditions and prevailing ideologies that someone's steeped in. And in that, I would say that thinking of counterculture in a sort of binary way, like the counterculture is opposite, it just actually, I think that is from a very Western worldview. I understand the counterculture more in this composting way. We don't get to absolutely extricate ourselves from the world as it is and create something that is in like a silo, and this is like utopia in a vacuum.
And talk about set and setting, that goes back really far. The moment that like certain ideologies were like humans are separate from nature. So it even goes back even like further, like really, really deep to what you're saying.
And that sort of cultural conditioning is deeply ingrained. So we don't get to just pull ourselves out of it. What we can do is tend to the edges of culture and create in permaculture or other sort of ecological frameworks. There's this concept called an ecotone, where two ecosystems meet, and this in that middle is actually the most vibrant, dynamic, resilient part of the environment. And it's really crucial that we tend to that space, because I feel like the if we build the community capacity to steward medicine and do healing work, I think of it more as like an alchemy, because I have a lot of reservations, honestly, around, like, there's a part of me that's like, yeah, give the cops the mushrooms. And then there's a part of me that's like, cops in ketamine therapy who are maybe becoming more well adjusted and like finding comfort in performing their duties that have like root violence and just the very
Mm,
structure. Do we want that? And I'm not saying I'm not sure, but I think what's most important is that we really get a sort of cultural track to restoration, especially in those regards. I do have a lot of concern around psychedelics just being used to make more people more well adjusted to their oppression and to times that we actually need to really awaken to, and not just be comfortable with, and be at ease with. There's reasons why we are facing the sort of illnesses that we face, and we're not responsive to just stay in the disease, but the way in which we're working with medicines will really shape our experience and shape the meaning in the integration process, and just like the culture that's being built around them. There's no guarantee that the cultures that come from people who are working with psychedelics are actually counterculture to the dominant culture. They can absolutely just be amplification of the dominant culture.
yeah, that's super interesting. One of my colleagues, Danielle Herrera, I overheard her say, one of the goals with psychedelics is to not recondition people to be more complacent to systems
Right.
of colonization, oppression, and trauma. Like, the
Yeah.
goal is to not condition folks through the use of psychedelics to be more, let's say, resilient or grounded or have more equanimity, just so that they can go back into more trauma
Keep
and more,
perpetuating. Yeah.
oppressive systems. And it's one of the tenets that we share in our integration process.
Mhm.
If we're talking about the set and setting piece, where we talk to folks about, in our integration guide that we have on our e-commerce store now, is about, okay, you can do a lot of this inner work, but if you come back into the people and the communities and the triggers in your normal life, then it then becomes a little bit of an uphill battle. And so we're talking to folks about, be mindful of the people you have around you, be mindful of the communities that you're in, be mindful of the media and things that you're consuming, which I think speaks to this larger piece of, culture shift. And, I'll also say that it's really beautiful to know, talking about culture shift, because there's this question that I'm going to ask you, which is, okay, how is this tangible for our audience? Like, what
Yeah.
can people do to actually
Yeah.
enact, culture shift and change? And one thing that I'll say before I hear from you is, I love it when parents are reaching out to advocate for their kid,
Mhm.
21 and up, or so on, who's going through a challenging time and might be exploring psychedelics. We have kids, like children in their 30s and 40s, who are advocating for their parents. We have, conversations at the dinner table now, about this. We have folks who are admitting they've been microdosing for a while and they're not a harm or a danger to society. And so I think that there is a little bit of a culture shift that's naturally happening. And I think that as a part of that, one of the goals that I have is, how do we create more avenues of safe and meaningful access and use to this? And as I'm hearing you talk more, I'm like, oh, weird. Like, Psychedelic Passage, we're a business, we provide a service, we have these offerings, but we're also like a community model in some type of a degree. Like, we got to hold a different community container for the psychedelic interested, curious folks. We got to hold a different community for our referral network, of which they're all agreeing on standards of practice and scope and ethics and all of that. we got to create, different pathways on how all of those can emerge together, and then also play in this like gray space. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can make this a little bit more tangible for our listeners and viewers. Like when we talk about a couple of your elements, the connection and the crossover between the regulated market versus the community model, which is in itself a dualistic view. And I'm hearing you say that a lot of this emphasis is in culture change and community change. Like, how can that be tangible for our listeners? Like, what would be some things that you would suggest for folks to do their own exploration in this?
I often honestly find myself at odds with solution oriented people and conversations because I don't ever want to be prescriptive. But I will say that, of course, there's a lot of individual agency and responsibility required. And in that, and part of, what's being composted when we work with medicine, we experience the transpersonal or the interdependent fact of beingness and that we are our relations. That was once held as the norm, the obvious truth. And so there is a remembering of that. As an individual, we are made up of our relations. We are what we eat. And there's that saying that's you're made up of your 5 best friends, like you're like the amalgamation of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a real need to take really sincerely and seriously the medicine path, the path to healing, the path to wholeness, whatever modalities you're working with. Eventually, and ideally as soon as possible, you enter into a communal understanding and practice of that work and those practices. And you bring it and you build it into your relationships. And all of us can do this. All of us can create these little microcosms of a culture. And we do this. We're already doing this in whatever level of consciousness or sort of like default droning. We're participating in culture making every moment. And you don't have to take it as a political act, although I do believe it is, that everything that we do is part of how power is moving and power is shifting. And so the choices that we make and how we are together and where our energy and attention and resources go create the sort of culture that we're going to ultimately be shaped by as well. And so it's just important to always keep that in mind, that the medicine work, if it's just about individual, like personal growth and wellness, then it's not accomplishing that at all.
It's not the whole thing.
It's not even, it's just actually a warped sort of premise to be operating from that begets more of the same. It furthers this neurotic sort of pathology of being separate and the pursuit of sort of an American dream idea of like
Interesting.
what's
Yeah.
important in life, and what's most important in life is taking care of our relationships and tending to the soil of our life, which is the web of life.
Yeah. That's so interesting. What I hear you saying is that there can actually be some harm in this like more self-focused, egocentric conversation around psychedelics, which is like, how can I alleviate my symptoms? How can I find my own personal growth and healing if that isn't within a larger context of, okay, how can I return back to my family, my society, and all of that? And I think a lot about, I don't know if our listeners are aware, but I discovered the past couple of years that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is like really common. It started off with, this is talking about like you need food, shelter, safety for you to be able to move into a higher level of actualization of emotional, health and well-being, to mental health and well-being, up to like self-actualization. It's like this triangle. Well, what we learned is actually a lot of that actually came from the Blackfoot
Yeah.
culture and tradition. And that one is actually, how do you actualize yourself so that you can show up in your community and actualize better? And so it's just an example on how that's like threaded upon our like American culture, where it's about me and my healing and my growth, like separate from all this other stuff.
And what's real, I'm really glad that you've brought this in, because what's so important to know about that cultural flip of this, of a ontology, of like a worldview, and it's how to be a human.
Mm.
That's all, how to be human. The first thing is self-actualization is a cultural given. That's not something that each individual has to strive for. That's something that the commons, that the people, they orient in that way, that every being is precious, and their life, whether their life is short-lived and they end up not making it that long into like an old life, but that there is a spiritual function to all life. And so all is sacred. You don't have to prove that, you know. When you start from there, there's a different sort of an expression of an understanding of what medicine is, or what healing even is. If healing, like just, getting into the etymology, is wholeness, then it's all of these parts that have become fugitive and have been suppressed or oppressed or wounded or exiled, coming back into a whole dignified life. And we do that individually, and where we actually make that happen, where the rubber hits the road, is in our relationships with beyond self.
Yeah, one of the takeaways that I'm hearing as far as a tangible piece for our listeners and viewers is that you don't work in a vacuum. You do have the sovereignty and this right to engage with psychedelics in whatever way makes sense for you. But the choices that you make on how to do that can influence how other folks do that.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that we see here at Psychedelic Passage all the time, is that when folks realize this need for support services, especially around first-time journeyers, right? They realize the support need. That becomes then the socially accepted way of how to engage with psychedelics intentionally. And so that also can create some barriers, I think, to this question that you had, which is like, who's allowed to do this work? Who's allowed to engage in psychedelics? How do we go about that? Is that just relegated to a regulatory model? Is there room for, something that you said prior to our episode, community infrastructure frameworks, in alignment of what could be offered here on the community side? And I think Colorado has a very unique juncture in our, history, the live history right now, on like how to go about, doing that. So I really appreciate it. And as we wrap up this episode, I'm wondering if you can share, how can people follow your work more? I know that you are really driven by your goals through My Coalition. Are there other ways that folks can participate, be a part of the conversation as it relates to your work?
Yeah, the My Coalition is the primary venue for the work that's related to this conversation. At the My Coalition on Instagram, we have a landing page up right now where we've been in this big transition. A full website's coming soon, but it's the mycoalition.org. You can go learn more there, and there are links to register to become a member of the My Coalition. The My Coalition is a member-based coalition. To be a member, it's as little as $1 a year. It's sliding scale. Jimmy's a member, shout out. And it's a network, like Jimmy alluded to. We're creating this mycelially modeled coalition where the initiatives that are prioritized in the coalition are member driven. And the primary function of the coalition is to support and activate community initiatives and build community capacity through this membership model and design that we use. We create constellations of people who are basically, in like a focused group, whether it's identity, affinity, vocation. But there's some common work that people come around within the My Coalition, and we incubate that. And then we help support and activate and provide, there's proposals for budgeting to help people get their community work, actually manifest. And there's more I could say to that. The only other plug I will put in there as far as culture work, and this is aside from the My Coalition, is a dance called Drip Rhythm. And right now, the only way to stay in the loop with us is through our Instagram. It's at Drip Rhythm. And that's a dance space that it's bringing medicine movement, that movement medicine, back to this medicine movement. And it's not just for psychedelic movement or psychedelic adjacent folks. Even the alchemy of Drip Rhythm is really bringing people into dance ritual to harmonize our bodies and bring us around a shared prayer of a common action. So we co-host a different community initiative with every dance. And we're looking to have one, if not in November and December, for people in Colorado. Definitely look out for that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I find that as folks work in psychedelics, they're also coming back into their bodies, into their emotions, into their feelings. And so I really totally hear that. And, ultimately, we're all just trying to figure out how to be human. And I think the pursuit of intentional psychedelic, medicine is a part of that. So thank you so much, Duffy, for being a guest here on this episode. That wraps up this episode for us. So you can download episodes of the Psychedelic Passage podcast anywhere you find your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, iHeartRadio. We also post our videos on YouTube. And we look forward to seeing you on our next episode.